before listening to this sermon, if you could please read the chapter 1 of the book of 2 Samuel. Although I'm actually going to be covering content from chapters 1 to 5 of 2 Samuel. But if you just read chapter 1, and I'll read some portions from the other chapters as we go through. The BBC's coverage of the King's coronation started at 8 AM on Saturday and continued until late Sunday evening. It included interviews with those who'd come to London to join the celebrations. It included the procession through the flag-waving public lining the streets. It included the crowning event, followed by the singing of God Save the King. It included coverage of the many street parties that happened on the Saturday and Sunday. And it concluded with the coronation concert, featuring global celebrities all joining to show their support. During this 3-day celebrations, what percentage of the BBC's coverage was devoted to the King's enemies, to anti-royalists, to the Not My King movement? Well, I'd suggest that maybe 10% of the coverage was devoted to them. 90% of the coverage was devoted to the King's supporters, whereas 10% was devoted to the enemies of the King. Now understand this: in the events of chapters 1 to 5 of 2 Samuel, these figures are completely reversed. 90% of chapters 1 to 5, the events leading up to the crowning of King David, 90% of these chapters are devoted to the enemies of the king. Chapter 1 is all about Saul, the one who made himself an enemy of David and tried to have David killed. And chapter 1 is all about David mourning Saul's death. Chapters 2 and 3, which I'll read from later, are all about Abner, the army commander of Saul's army. Abner's next project, now that Saul was dead, was to make Saul's son king instead of David. And yet, chapter 3 is all about David showing grace to Abner, when Abner later repented and changed sides. Chapter 4 is all about Ishbosheth, David's rival to the throne. And yet, when Ishbosheth's head is brought to David on a platter, the first thing David does isn't snatch the crown. Instead, David sheds a tear. 90% of chapters 1 to 5 are devoted to the king's attitude to his enemies. Which begs the question, why? Well, I watched 5 minutes of King Charles' coronation, and I left feeling how irrelevant it was to people like me. People singing in Latin, people wearing golden robes, clothes that no average person ever wears, people in attendance who have titles such as Lord and Bishop and Prince. The one thing that was relevant to me was the backstory to those in attendance. Harry has probably said 1 or 2 things about the king that he regrets. I can relate to that. Saying things that I regret, being ungrateful, turning my back on God, my supposed king. Prince Andrew, I'll be honest, I don't know that much about him, so I Wikipedia'd him. That's the page on the internet that summarises Prince Andrew's life. And 50% of that Wikipedia page is about the things that Prince Andrew is probably ashamed of. That's a percentage I can relate to. If everything in my life, every thought in my mind was made public, I'd probably want at least 50% hidden. Rowan Atkinson was also at the coronation. You know, he was sat in Westminster Abbey singing God Save the King at the same time as his film Johnny English was being aired on Channel 4. You know, that's kind of hypocritical, don't you think? Paying lip service to the king whilst his character Johnny English is competing with the king on the other channel. On a more serious note, I'm a hypocrite, paying lip service to God, my king, when in reality I'm living for my own agenda. Let's not even get started on the other people in attendance, which included morally questionable prime ministers and numerous adulterers. Even Archbishop Justin Welby got a speeding tick the week after. You know, the most relevant thing about the coronation was that everyone in attendance was a sinner. And it's for reasons like this that you cannot accuse the Bible of being irrelevant. It's written for sinners, hypocrites, those who've done things that they're ashamed of, those who've made themselves enemies of God. The Bible is written for people like you and me. It's for this reason that 90% of the Bible's content is devoted to God's grace towards his enemies. For God's grace is something that we all need. I'll now read some bits from chapter 2. Meanwhile, Abner, son of Ner, the commander of Saul's army, had taken Ishbosheth, son of Saul, and brought him over to Mahanaim. He made him king over Gilead, Ashuri, and Jezreel, and also over Ephraim, Benjamin, and all Israel. Ishbosheth, son of Saul, was 40 years old when he became king over Israel, and he reigned for 2 years. The tribe of Judah, however, remained loyal to David. The time of David was king in Hebron over Judah was 7 years and 6 months. Abner, son of Ner, together with the men of Ishbosheth, son of Saul, left Mahanaim and went to Gibeon. Joab, son of Zeruiah, and David's men also went out and met them at the pool of Gibeon. One group sat down on one side of the pool, and one group on the other. Then Abner said to Joab, "Let's have some of the young men get up and fight hand to hand in front of us." "All right, let them do it," Joab said. So they stood up and were counted off, 12 men for Benjamin and Ishbosheth, son of Saul, and 12 for David. Then each grabbed his opponent by the head and thrust his dagger into his opponent's side, and they fell down together. So that place in Gibeon was called Helkath Hazzuim. The battle that day was very fierce, and Abner and the Israelites were defeated by David's men. The 3 sons of Zeruiah were there, Joab, Abishai, and Asahel. Now Asahel was as fleet-footed as a wild gazelle. He chased Abner, turning neither to the right nor to the left as he pursued him. Abner looked behind him and asked, "Is that you, Asahel?" "Is it he?" he answered. Then Abner said to him, "Turn aside to the right or to the left, take on one of the young men and strip him of his weapons." But Asahel would not stop chasing him. Again Abner warned Asahel, "Stop chasing me. Why should I strike you down? How could I look your brother Joab in the face?" But Asahel refused to give up the pursuit. So Abner thrust the butt of his spear into Asahel's stomach, and the spear came out through his back. He fell there and died on the spot, and every man stopped when he came to the place where Asahel had fallen and died. After 10 young men from both Judah and Israel die, resulting in no advantage to either side, another man dies after having a spear thrust through his body, all the way through so that it comes out the other end. You might wish verses like this weren't in the Bible. Skip over them, don't think about them, move on. But, like the men of Judah after the bloody scene, we're meant to stop pause and think. We read in verse 23 of chapter 2, "And every man stopped when he came to the place where Asahel had fallen and died." As the men of Judah stopped at the side of that bloody corpse, they were left thinking, is this really what we want? What is all this fighting, violence actually achieving? Do we really want hatred to be the foundation of this new kingdom, if these are the results? Like the people of Judah, we're meant to stop at these verses and ask, do we want to be part of a divided kingdom? A kingdom fighting against each other, characterized by hatred and violence? Or do we want the kingdom David will establish, a united kingdom, one in which grace is shown to enemies, balanced with righteousness, justice, and peace? Is a graceless kingdom really what we want? Do we really want a social media world that's primarily about communicating the flaws of others to as many people as possible? Do we really want a world in which an out-of-place eyebrow hair moves somebody from the category of beautiful to ugly? Do we really want to be part of a home in which an out-of-place coffee cup results in bickering and disapproving frowns? Do we really want to be a part of a workplace in which employees enjoy pulling each other down rather than supporting each other to improve? Like the people of Judah, we're meant to stop and look at the bloody corpses that a graceless kingdom results in. When we are quick to anger, when we take delight in condemning others, when we make judging others a pastime. Like the people of Judah, we're meant to stop at these verses and ask, is this really what we want? I'll continue reading from chapter 2. "So every man stopped when he came to the place where Asahel had befallen and died. But Joab and Abishai pursued Abner, and as the sun was setting, they came to the hill of Ammah, near Giah, on the way to the wasteland of Gibeon. Then the men of Benjamin rallied behind Abner. They formed themselves into a group and took their stand on top of a hill. Abner called out to Joab, 'Must the sword devour forever? Don't you realize that this will end in bitterness? How long before you order your men to stop pursuing their fellow Israelites?' Joab answered, 'As surely as God lives, if you had not spoken, the men would have continued pursuing them until morning.'" Joab clearly did want to live in a graceless kingdom. For unlike David, who extended grace towards his enemies, Joab immediately chased after his enemy, Abner, with the sword. Joab later gave up the chase, but later, when Abner repented of his anti-David rebellion, Joab still had his sword in his hand. Reading it from chapter 3. "Then Abner sent messengers on his behalf to say to David, 'Whose land is it? Make an agreement with me, and I will help you bring all Israel over to you.' 'Good,' said David, 'I will make an agreement with you.' Abner conferred with the elders of Israel and said, 'For some time you have wanted to make David your king. Now do it, for the Lord promised David, "By my servant David I will rescue my people Israel from the hand of the Philistines and from the hand of all their enemies." Abner also spoke to the Benjamites in person. Then he went to Hebron to tell David everything that Israel and the whole tribe of Benjamin wanted to do. When Abner, who had 20 men with him, came to David at Hebron, David prepared a feast for him and his men. Then Abner said to David, "Let me go at once and assemble all Israel for my lord the king, so that they may make a covenant with you, and that you may rule over all that your heart desires." So David sent Abner away, and he went in peace. Just then David's men and Joab returned from a raid and brought with them a great deal of plunder. But Abner was no longer with David in Hebron, because David had sent him away, and he had gone in peace. When Joab and all the soldiers with him arrived, he was told that Abner son of Ner had come to the king, and that the king had sent him away, and that he had gone in peace. So Joab went to the king and said, "What have you done? Look, Abner came to you. Why did you let him go? Now he is gone. You know Abner son of Ner, he came to deceive you and observe your movements and find out everything you are doing." Joab then left David and sent messengers after Abner, and they brought him back from the cistern at Sirah. But David did not know it. Now when Abner returned to Hebron, Joab took him aside into an inner chamber, as if to speak with him privately. And there, to avenge the blood of his brother Ashiel, Joab stabbed him in the stomach, and he died. Later, when David heard about this, he said, "I and my kingdom are forever innocent before the Lord concerning the blood of Abner son of Ner. May his blood fall on the head of Joab and on his whole family. May Joab's family never be without someone who has a running sore or leprosy, or who leans on a crutch, or who falls by the sword, or who lacks food." Joab and his brother Abishai murdered Abner, because he had killed their brother Ashiel in the battle at Gibeon. If you read all of 2 Samuel, you'll notice that David's use of the sword is repeatedly contrasted with Joab's use of the sword. In chapter 1, David encounters an Amalekite. David encounters this Amalekite immediately after an incident in which other Amalekites had burned down his temporary home, as well as kidnapping the women, children, and elderly who lived there. When this Amalekite tells David the group of people he belongs to, David doesn't pick up his sword immediately. Just because David's having a bad day, he doesn't take it out on others. David isn't so consumed by hatred for the Amalekites that it expresses itself at every turn to every Amalekite that he meets. David only picks up the sword when he realizes the man is guilty of treason. You know, there's a use of the sword that is motivated by justice, and there's a use of the sword motivated by pride, cruelty, and bitter hate. In chapter 3, Abner, David's enemy, repents of his anti-David campaign, and so David puts down his sword and lets Abner go in peace. David is slow to anger, gentle in dealing with others, and quick to forgive. And in chapter 4, it is not David who pursues his enemy Ishbosheth. David knows it's not his role to judge and decide who should be king, and so he leaves the role of judge of the universe to God. Contrast this to Joab. Joab clings onto the sword even when Abner is repentant. Joab took the law into his own hands. We read later that Joab is quick to anger and has the appearance of being a person of grace, but in his heart he is not. Reading from chapter 18 and chapter 20, we read that Joab once said, I'm not going to wait like this for you. So he took 3 javelins in his hand and plunged them into Absalom's heart. 3 javelins. You don't need 3 javelins to kill someone unless you're extremely angry and consumed by bitterness. Chapter 20, Then Joab took Amasa by the beard with his right hand to kiss him. Amasa was not on his guard against the dagger in Joab's hand, and Joab plunged it into his belly, and his intestines spilled out on the ground. Without being stabbed again, Amasa died. Now let's stop looking at Joab for a moment and start looking at ourselves. If you are a Christian, your king is not David, but Jesus, a king whose kingdom is also characterized by grace. I count myself a citizen of his kingdom. Maybe you do too. But does our treatment of others always reflect this? Like Jesus, David did not delight in his enemy's downfall. We read in chapter 1 that David specifically told the Israelites not to take delight in Saul's death. Rejoice not, proclaim it not in the streets, be glad not. That was David's word to the Israelites and to the towns around. Like Jesus, David did not delight in his enemy's downfall. And yet, how easily I find myself delighting in judging and criticizing others. Talking about other people's faults to others is a pastime. Do we not sometimes enjoy these things? And yet, like Jesus, David, as king, held a position in which it was right to call wrong wrong, and which he was perfectly within his rights to use the sword. And yet, like Jesus, David still left room for grace. In chapter 3 we read that David says, I was gentle today with Abner, though anointed king. These men, the sons of Zeruiah, are more severe than I. Like Jesus, David was gentle in dealing with his enemies, though he was perfectly within his rights to be severe. Now ask yourself this. When exposed to the errors of others, could the words gentle and gracious be used to describe you? David was grieved by the sight of his enemy's death. Our King Jesus was the same. We read in the New Testament, Jesus Christ gave himself for us. He himself bore our sins in his body on the tree. Jesus knew all the things that we've done that deserve condemnation, the judgment of God. But the thought of our death caused him great grief. And so what did Jesus do? Well, Jesus said, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. Don't you want to be a part of that kingdom? A kingdom where there is mercy for sinners. A kingdom where God offers grace to the repentant. A kingdom where God deals with people like us with patience and grace. The reason 90% of the Bible is about these things is because we all need them. And Jesus, like David, calls us to show these things to other people as well. In the words of Paul, get rid of all bitterness, rage and anger, brawling and slander, along with every form of malice. Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other, just as in Christ God forgave you. Follow God's example, therefore, as dearly loved children, and walk in the way of love, just as Christ loved us, and gave himself up for us as a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God.